The frost had settled hard on the valley floor by mid-October, a premature blanket of white that snapped the last of the autumn stalks and turned the mud of the cattle trails into ankle-twisting iron. Tobias stood at the edge of his property line, his breath pluming in the biting air as he looked out over the acreage the townspeople had quietly mocked him for buying. It was rocky, uneven terrain, backing up against a sheer limestone bluff that made grazing difficult and farming nearly impossible. The soil was thin, barely covering the bedrock, and the wind coming off the northern peaks had a way of funneling through the draw with enough force to strip the shingles off a well-built barn. But Tobias, having buried his wife only 6 months prior and finding himself with dwindling funds, had seen something the others had missed, or perhaps simply ignored in their pursuit of flat, easy plow land. He walked toward the base of the bluff, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen scrub grass. The temperature was dropping rapidly, already well below freezing, and the sky had that heavy, leaden look that promised a winter of historic cruelty. His existing coop, a ramshackle lean-to left by the previous tenant, was already failing. The wind whistled through the gaps in the siding, and he had found 2 hens frozen stiff on the roost just that morning. As he approached the limestone face, the air changed. It was a subtle shift at first, a softening of the biting cold against his cheek, but as he stepped through the heavy brush obscuring the cleft in the rock, the difference became undeniable. A steady, rhythmic trickling sound echoed from the darkness. Tobias struck a lucifer match, shielding it with a calloused hand, and stepped inside the cavern. The air here was not warm, exactly, but it was constant. A steady 55 degrees that felt like a tropical embrace compared to the biting chill outside. The thermal mass of the mountain held the earth's heat, and a stream of clear, running water cut through the limestone floor, bubbling up from an aquifer deep below before disappearing again into a fissure near the entrance. He watched the steam rise faintly from the water where it met the colder air near the mouth of the cave. This was not just a hole in the ground, it was a geothermal engine. While the rest of the territory braced for a freeze that would kill livestock and shatter water troughs, this cave breathed. He looked at the stone floor, covered in decades of debris and bat guano, and then at the stream. He didn't see a dark pit. He seen a fortress against the winter. He needed to move the flock, not just to a better shed, but into the earth itself. The following morning, Tobias drove his wagon into town, the wheels rattling violently over the frozen ruts of the main road. He needed supplies, wire, lumber, and hinges, and he had precious little coin to spare for them. The general store was crowded, the potbelly stove in the center of the room drawing men in from the cold like moths. Mercer, a cattleman with a sprawling ranch on the south side of the valley, leaned against the counter, watching Tobias load a keg of nails and several rolls of heavy-gauge wire. Mercer had been the loudest voice advising Tobias against the purchase of the rocky bluff, and he seemed to take a grim satisfaction in the harsh start to the winter. "Fixing up that lean-to, Tobias?" Mercer asked, his voice carrying over the low murmur of the store. "Waste of good nails. Wind up there will tear it down faster than you can hammer it up. You'd be better off eating those birds now and saving the feed." Tobias didn't pause in his counting of the copper pennies on the counter. "Not for the lean-to," Tobias said, his voice flat and calm. "I'm moving the operation into the bluff." The shop went quiet for a moment. Mercer chuckled, a dry, scratching sound. "The cave? You putting chickens in a cave? They ain't bats, son. They need light. They need dry ground. You put 'em in that damp hole, they'll rot on the foot within a week. That's if the varmints don't get 'em first." Tobias finished his transaction, sliding the heavy roll of wire onto his shoulder. He turned to Mercer, his expression unreadable. "They need water that don't freeze," Tobias said. "And they need to not turn into blocks of ice when the nor'easter hits next week. The cave stays 50 degrees. Does your barn stay 50 degrees, Mercer?" The cattleman frowned, straightening up. "It ain't natural. You'll kill the lot of them." Tobias nodded once, acknowledging the doubt without accepting it. "We'll see," he said, and walked out into the biting wind. He knew the risks. He knew about the dampness and the light. But he had a plan for that, a plan born of long nights staring at the ceiling and calculating the angles of the winter sun. He wasn't just going to throw chickens in a hole. He was going to engineer an ecosystem. The labor began before the sun crested the peaks the next day. The cave floor was uneven, littered with fallen shale and slick with the droppings of bats that had long since migrated south for the season. The smell was sharp, ammoniac, but beneath it was the clean, mineral scent of the running water. Tobias started by clearing the debris, using a flat-edged shovel to scrape the limestone floor down to the bedrock. It was backbreaking work. The guano, however, was not waste. It was potent fertilizer, and he carefully shoveled it into sacks to be aged for the spring planting, stacking them near the entrance where the air circulation was highest. Once the floor was clear, he turned his attention to the stream. It meandered lazily across the center of the cavern, creating a muddy verge that would indeed rot a chicken's foot, just as Mercer had predicted. Tobias had to control the water. He spent 3 days hauling river stones from the valley floor up to the bluff, his wagon groaning under the weight. Inside the cave, he worked by the light of 2 kerosene lanterns, the glow reflecting off the damp walls. He built a channel for the stream, lining the bed with flat slate and building up the banks with the river stones and a mortar he mixed from local clay and lime. He deepened the channel, increasing the flow rate, which kept the water moving swiftly enough to prevent stagnation. This was the lifeline of the coop. He designed the layout so the chickens could access the water through slats in the fencing, allowing them to drink but preventing them from fouling the stream. The sound of the water changed from a meander to a purposeful rush, a constant white noise that filled the cavern. He verified the drainage, pouring a bucket of water on the stone floor to ensure it sloped toward the stream channel. It did. The floor would stay dry. His hands were raw, the skin cracked from the cold outside and the rough stone inside, but as he stood in the entrance and wiped the sweat from his brow, he felt the warm breath of the cave against his back. The temperature outside had dropped another 10 degrees, but inside, the water flowed unfrozen, and the air was still. The preparation was done. Now came the construction. Construction of the coops required a precision that belied the rough setting. Tobias couldn't simply drive posts into the ground. The floor was solid limestone. Instead, he had to build a freestanding framework, a skeleton of timber that used its own weight and geometry to remain stable. He used rough-hewn cedar, known for its resistance to rot in damp environments, cutting the beams outside in the freezing daylight and hauling them in one by one. He constructed a raised platform for the roosts, 18 inches off the stone floor. This allowed cold air to sink below the birds while their body heat generated a microclimate in the upper rafters of the structure. He designed the nesting boxes to face the interior of the cave, away from the entrance, giving the hens the privacy and darkness they preferred for laying, but he positioned the run to extend toward the cave mouth. The lack of sunlight was the critical problem Mercer had identified, and Tobias had a solution that relied on the specific geography of the bluff. The cave mouth faced southeast. He built the front of the enclosure not with solid wood, but with the heavy-gauge wire he had purchased, stretching it taut between the cedar posts. He then constructed a large, angled frame covered in white canvas, positioned just outside the cave entrance. It acted as a reflector. Even on short winter days, the low sun hit the canvas and bounced diffused, bright light deep into the cavern. It wasn't direct sunlight, which could be fleeting, but a consistent ambient glow that extended the perceived daylight hours for the birds. He fashioned troughs from hollowed-out logs, lining them with tin, and positioned them directly over the running stream. The ambient heat of the water would keep the mash from freezing. He worked methodically, measuring twice, cutting once, his breath invisible in the tempered air of the cave. He built a heavy wooden door at the transition point between the deep cave and the entrance tunnel, a way to seal the flock in if the wind shifted directly into the mouth. It was a fortress of cedar and wire, anchored by stone and fed by the earth's own blood. The transfer happened under the threat of the first true blizzard of the season. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the wind was screaming down the canyon, tearing the last dead leaves from the scrub oaks. Tobias moved with urgent haste, carrying crates of panicked, squawking chickens from the failing lean-to up the rocky path to the bluff. The birds were cold, their combs pale and their feathers fluffed against a chill that was penetrating their bones. He made 12 trips, his lungs burning with the exertion, the snow beginning to fall in hard, horizontal sheets that stung his face like sand. The old coop was already groaning under the wind shear, a piece of roofing tin flapping violently. As he carried the last crate into the cave, the silence was immediate and profound. The howling wind was reduced to a distant murmur. He opened the crates, releasing the hens into their new subterranean home. Initially, they were terrified, huddled together in the corner of the cedar run, confused by the stone walls and the echo of their own clucking. But the environment began to work on them almost immediately. There was no biting wind to ruffle their feathers. The ground beneath their feet was dry stone and cedar, not frozen mud. Tobias scattered grain across the floor of the run, the sound of the kernels hitting the stone drawing their attention. One brave Rhode Island red stepped forward, pecked at the grain, and then shook herself, her feathers settling. She walked to the water trough, dipped her beak, and drank. The water was liquid. She didn't have to chip through ice. Slowly, the others followed. Tobias lit a lantern and hung it from the central post. The lantern glow filled the cavern, casting long, dancing shadows against the limestone walls as the storm outside raged with a violence that shook the very bedrock of the valley. For 4 days, a whiteout buried the territory under 3 feet of drift, but inside the bluff, time seemed to detach from the brutality of the season. Tobias established a routine dictated by the rhythm of the flock and the maintenance of the cave's ecosystem. He ran a heavy guide rope from his back porch to the scrub oak near the cave entrance, a lifeline that allowed him to navigate the blinding whiteness to tend to the birds without losing his bearings in the void. Inside, the temperature held steady. The thermometer he had hung on the center post read 48 degrees even when the mercury on his porch plunged to 20 below zero. The chickens, creatures of habit and biology, responded to the environment with a certainty that defied the season. The reflector canvas, though battered by the wind, managed to catch the diffuse gray light of the blizzard and funnel it into the cave, keeping the hens' circadian rhythms synchronized. They scratched at the dry cedar shavings Tobias had spread over the stone floor, dusting themselves and clucking with a contentment that seemed impossible given the frozen hellscape just 50 yards away. On the 3rd morning of the storm, Tobias reached into a nesting box lined with dry straw and felt the smooth, warm curve of an egg. It was brown, speckled, and substantial. He held it up to the lantern light, checking for cracks. In the dead of a winter that was killing cattle in the open fields, his flock had begun to lay. As the weeks dragged on, the initial blizzard gave way to a relentless, grinding cold that settled into the bones of the territory. The valley became a landscape of silence. Reports from town, gathered during Tobias's infrequent and arduous trips for supplies, were grim. Livestock were freezing where they stood. Feed prices had tripled as supply lines from the south choked off. Farmers were burning their fence posts for heat. Yet, inside the cave, Tobias faced a different problem: the management of abundance and humidity. The stream, while a source of heat, also introduced moisture into the air. If the humidity rose too high, the chickens would be susceptible to respiratory rust. Tobias improvised a ventilation system. He located a natural fissure in the cave ceiling, 40 feet up, likely an old steam vent. He built a chimney of sorts using spare stovepipe, extending it up toward the fissure to draw the warmer, moist air up and out, creating a natural draft that pulled fresh, drier air in through the baffled entrance. He also realized that his grain supply would not last the winter if he fed it dry. He needed to stretch the calories. He looked at the warm water of the stream and the sacks of oats. He began a system of sprouting. He built shallow wooden trays and set them on rocks directly in the stream's flow, allowing the water to soak the grain for a few hours before lifting them onto the racks. In the humid warmth of the cave, the oats sprouted within days, turning into dense mats of green fodder. He was feeding his chickens fresh greens in the middle of January. The birds devoured the mats, roots and all. The result was visible in the eggs. The yolks turned a deep, vibrant orange, rich with nutrients, a stark contrast to the pale, watery yolks of the few winter eggs usually found in the territory. The system faced its greatest physical challenge in early February, not from the cold itself, but from the physics of the water exiting the cave. The temperature outside dropped to a record low, hovering near 30 degrees below zero for 3 consecutive nights. The stream, which flowed freely inside the cave, began to freeze the moment it hit the outside air. The ice built up rapidly at the exit fissure, creating a dam that began to back the water up into the cavern. Tobias arrived one morning to find the water level in the channel had risen 6 inches, threatening to spill over the banks and flood the coop floor. If the bedding got wet, the ammonia levels would spike, and the flock would be dead within days. He had to clear the exit, but he couldn't simply chip the ice away. It would freeze again within the hour. He had to insulate the flow outside the cave. He spent a grueling 6 hours in the biting cold, constructing a tunnel over the exiting stream using snow blocks and packed brush. He essentially extended the cave environment another 20 feet down the slope, burying the stream under 4 feet of snow. The snow acted as an insulator, trapping the heat of the water and preventing the flash freezing effect at the mouth. He worked until his beard was a solid block of ice, his hands numbed despite his heavy mittens. When he finally broke through the ice dam from the inside, the water rushed out with a roar, disappearing into his snow tunnel and flowing freely beneath the drift. The water level in the cave receded. The crisis was averted through understanding the thermal properties of the very snow that threatened them. By March, the grip of the winter began to loosen, though the valley remained locked in gray mud and lingering drifts. The town was gaunt. The general store's shelves were bare of anything fresh. People were surviving on salted pork, dried beans, and the last of the root cellars. The psychological toll of the darkness and hunger was evident in the hollow eyes of the men gathered around the stove. Tobias hitched his team, the horses stepping high through the slush and mud that caked the wagon wheels. In the bed of the wagon, packed carefully in crates filled with sawdust, were 30 dozen eggs. He had more. The flock had been prolific on the fodder diet, but this was what he could safely transport. He covered the crates with a heavy wool blanket. The journey to town was slow. He passed Mercer's ranch on the way. The fields were littered with the carcasses of cattle that hadn't survived the deep freeze, their stiff legs pointing skyward, a grim testament to the brutality of the season. Mercer was by his fence line, repairing a wire, looking thin and worn. He watched Tobias pass, his eyes dropping to the wagon bed, though he said nothing. Tobias nodded, a simple gesture of recognition, and clucked to the horses, urging them toward the settlement. When Tobias walked into the general store carrying 2 crates, the conversation died instantly. He set them on the counter. The shopkeeper, a man named Holloway who had been rationing flour by the cup, looked at the crates with skepticism. "What you got there, Tobias?" "Rocks." Tobias didn't speak. He simply pried the lid off the first crate and pulled back the sawdust. The sight of the eggs, clean, large, and brown, was shocking in the dim light of the store. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. These weren't the small, preserved eggs from the autumn. These were fresh. Holloway reached out and picked one up, handling it like a diamond. "Fresh?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Laid yesterday," Tobias answered. And the day before, Mercer had followed Tobias into the store, standing at the back near the door. He pushed his way to the front, staring at the crate. "How?" Mercer asked, the mockery gone, replaced by a bewildered hunger. "My birds are dead." "Everyone's birds are dead or stopped laying in November." Tobias looked at the cattleman. "The cave," Tobias said simply. "Water flows, heat stays. I fed them sprouted oats." He didn't offer a lecture. He didn't smile. He just laid out the facts of the engineering. Holloway bought the entire shipment on the spot, paying a price that was 5 times the summer rate, and nobody complained. Tobias took a portion of the credit in flour and sugar, and the rest in coin. He turned to leave but stopped. He looked at Mercer, then back at the shopkeeper. "Let Mercer take 2 dozen on my tab," Tobias said. The room went silent again. Mercer looked up, his face reddening, pride warring with necessity. He had a wife at home who likely hadn't seen a fresh egg in 4 months. "I can pay," Mercer grunted, though everyone knew his herd was decimated. "I know," Tobias said, "but you don't have to." It wasn't charity. It was a rebalancing of the scales. The skepticism that had greeted his purchase of the bad land had been dismantled not by arguments, but by the undeniable reality of the eggs. Tobias climbed back onto the wagon seat, the leather reins cold in his grip. He signaled the horses, and the team leaned into the harness, pulling the empty wagon out of the muddy thoroughfare. The sun began to set as he made his way back to the bluff, casting a purple light over the melting snow. The cave was waiting for him, the steam rising gently from the entrance in the cooling air. The experiment had worked. He had taken the land that no one wanted, the rocky, vertical, dangerous land, and unlocked its value through observation and labor. The chickens clucked softly as he entered to check the feed troughs, the sound echoing off the limestone walls. He checked the stream. It was flowing clear and strong. He checked the thermometer. It was a steady 50 degrees. He realized then that he hadn't just built a coop. He had built a future. The cave would allow him to expand. He could raise broilers in the back cavern, maybe even try mushrooms in the darker recesses. The winter had taken everything from the valley, but it had given him this proof. He sat on an overturned bucket, watching the hens scratch in the cedar shavings, and for the first time since his wife had passed, he didn't feel the crushing weight of survival. He felt the sturdy, quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. The worthless hole in the ground was the most valuable structure in the county, and as he blew out the lantern and walked back toward the house, he knew the spring would bring not just a thaw, but a new beginning.